Hello, my name is Ryan Cortez, and I am currently an MSc candidate at York University. And today I'll be talking about my project titled Frequent Cannabis Use Does Not Result in Persisting Impairments of Visuomotor and Cognitive Performance. As many of us know, in 2018, recreational cannabis use was legalized in Canada. And this ultimately increased the amount of interest on the effect of cannabis on its users, including on their visuomotor function, which is the ability to respond to visual stimuli, and cognitive function, which of course is related to the brain. Unfortunately, previous studies regarding cannabis have mostly occurred in rehabilitation settings, jurisdictions where cannabis was or still remains illegal, or have small sample sizes, which collectively make it hard to generalize the results to the average user of cannabis. As a result, the 2018 legalization has provided us with the opportunity to research cannabis on a legal cohort of users outside of rehab settings and with larger sample sizes, which ultimately allows us to have stricter screening criteria. Within the study, we tried to answer the question of, are there differences related to frequency of cannabis use on visuomotor, and cognitive function? To answer this question, we created a browser-based study, which uses a set of well-established tasks that assess different components of executive functioning. Participants were able to complete the study on their personal computers from the comfort of home. And following a demographics questionnaire, participants were instructed to complete the tasks. Today, we'll be analyzing the last three: task switching, mirror reversal, and tunneling tasks. Our participants were all recruited from York University's undergraduate research participant pool, and since the tasks had different screening criteria, the sample size is varied, ranging from 461 to 694. The reason why there's a much larger proportion of female participants is because URPP is comprised of 70% of individuals who identify as female. We had three different experimental groups. First, non-users who have never used cannabis. Next, non-frequent users who use cannabis more than once every 3 months, but less than once a week, as seen in the light green of the figure. And finally, frequent users who use cannabis more than once a week in the dark green. So first, we'll be looking at performance on the task switching task, which assesses task switching abilities. To better understand task switching abilities, let's think about driving. In order to drive safely, you have to pay attention to other cars, pedestrians, the color of the traffic light, and several other considerations or tasks. So here's an example of the trial interface of the task. The right two images boxed in red are only shown for demonstration purposes and weren't actually included. In this task, you have a 2x2 grid with a single stimuli, and you have to respond using either the X or M key based on two different response conditions. If the stimuli is on the top two cells, you have to respond to the shape only. And if it's in the bottom two cells, you have to respond to the filling of the stimuli. For example, since this trial is on the top and it's a diamond, you have to respond with an X. The next trial is a square, which would require an M response. Since this trial is on the bottom, you would respond based on the number of dots, which would be an M. Note that this is called a switch trial, since you have to switch from responding to the shape to responding to the filling. Finally, this trial would require an M and is identified as a repeat trial, since the response condition is the same as the previous trial. There are also trials called single trials in which shape or filling is being responded to independently in blocks without any switching required. So first, let's look at reaction time, which is the time to respond to the stimuli after it appears. As we can see in this figure, the reaction time of switch trials is higher than single and repeat trials, which is what is commonly seen in the literature due to the increased decision-making required to switch between response conditions. Across cannabis use frequencies, however, we observed no differences with the reaction time. Next, let's look at accuracy, which is the percentage of trials that were correctly responded to. Similar to reaction time, switch trials had the poorest performance due to the increased difficulty. Interestingly, there were differences between non-users and non-frequent users of cannabis in the repeat and switch trials. However, it was noted that effect size was small and the non-users actually performed worse. As a result, there was a lack of significant differences in reaction times between the experimental groups. And although there were differences in accuracies between non-users and non-frequent users, the effect sizes was small and they didn't favor the non-user performance. Hence, there's little support for differences in task switching abilities between cannabis use frequencies. Next, let's look at the mirror reversal task, which assesses goal-directed movement planning. To better understand goal-directed movement planning, let's think about reverse parking into a parking lot. You have to really think about how you're going to plan and move your steering wheel in order to avoid hitting other cars and park safely. So here's the interface for the mirror reversal task. Your cursor is the black dot, and your objective is to move the cursor to the white dot. However, in this task, the cursor movement is reversed on the y-axis to your hand or mouse movement. So for example, in order to move the cursor to the white target at 30 degrees, You would have to move your hand or mouse 30 degrees in the opposite direction. So first, let's look at completion time, which is the time to react and move from the home position to the peripheral target. As we can see across the experimental groups, there was no difference in completion time. However, when comparing males and females, males had significantly lower completion time than females, albeit with only a small effect size. Next, let's talk about mirror reversal path length, which was the length or distance required to move to the target. The units of this variable is relative to the height of the screen, where the straightest path to the target would be 40% of the total screen height. However, it's more common to have a cursor path like this due to the increased difficulty associated with the reverse cursor. This results in extraneous movements and is not considered as efficient as a straight line path. As we can see in this figure, there is still no differences between cannabis use frequencies in the path length. As a result of the lack of differences in completion times or path length, this suggests a lack of differences in goal-directed movement planning between cannabis use frequencies. Additionally, although males did have a lower completion time, the effect size was fairly small and unlikely to demonstrate prominent differences between the sexes. Finally, we'll be discussing the tunneling task, which assesses motor acuity. A common task that also uses motor acuity is the fine motor movement of writing. When you try to write quickly, your print tends to get messier, whereas when you write slowly and take your time, the print tends to get neater and more legible. The goal of the tunneling task is to move your cursor, which is the black dot, to the blue target through the tunnel as quickly as possible while minimizing movement outside the tunnel. In a 100% accuracy trial, you would have a cursor path like this with zero movement outside the tunnel. However, it is much more common to have a cursor path like the one on the screen, which is much more streamlined and likely to be quicker, albeit with a lower percentage of movement within the tunnel. Furthermore, the tunnel can come in different sizes, ranging from 100% seen on the left to 40% of the original seen on the right, and can also be reversed 180 degrees on top of this. So first, let's look at completion time in the tunneling task, which was the time to react and move the cursor from the home position to the peripheral target and then return back to the home position. Between the different tunnel sizes and cannabis use frequencies, we can see that there is no difference in completion time. As a result, we will not be using completion time as a measure of performance and instead use accuracy, which is defined as the percentage of trial time that the cursor was within the tunnel. As we can see between the track sizes, their accuracy gets higher in the larger scales or sizes, and this makes sense because they have much more room to move their cursor within the tunnel. Between the experimental groups, however, there was no significant difference between cannabis use frequencies. We can also see this on time accuracy trade-off plots, where there was a large amount of overlap between the experimental groups, and it's pretty difficult to distinguish any performance differences. For the tunneling task, due to the lack of completion time differences, we used accuracy as our main performance measure. And in spite of this, we observed no differences in the experimental groups in terms of accuracy, suggesting that there is no difference in motor acuity between cannabis use frequencies. As a result of the general lack of performance differences across tasks, we can conclude that frequency of cannabis use is not associated with impairments to visual, motor, or cognitive functioning. Where there were differences, the effect sizes were small and non-users did not have better performance. Furthermore, we saw no interaction between sex and frequency of cannabis use. These results are reassuring because they help alleviate some concern that cannabis use is detrimental to our ability to complete activities of daily living safely. However, much more research is needed to confirm these results. In terms of our future directions, we are actually conducting another study in which we have participants consume cannabis before completing the same battery of tasks previously discussed. We're looking to observe if performance differences exist between those who are under the acute influence of cannabis versus how they compare to the results of the current study. Of course, I would like to thank my supervisor, Dr. Denise Enriquez, and my committee member, Dr. Lauren Sergio, for their continued guidance, as well as the entire Sensory Motor Control Lab for all their help making this work possible. Thank you for listening, and to the entire Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research for providing this opportunity to share this work.